So, hi everyone. My name is Jacqueline Shaw, and I have 15 years of experience working with children and adults who have ID. And I'm interested in obtaining a BCBA and applying ABA principles to employee behavior. So, today I would like to ask the question, how useful is a BCBA credential when pursuing a career in organizational behavior management? Mm. All right, so this presentation will examine points of view around the relevance of OBM to BCBA credential and licensure. And we will glance at the history of OBM in terms of ABA and scientific management prospectively. We will look at commonalities in practice between ABA and scientific management. Secondly, we'll look at a case study that describes an OBM consult's effectiveness in the field of ABA. Thirdly, we will examine two studies around the validity and reliability of a common OBM tool called the PDC-HS and how it scores amongst groups of people with varied or no education in ABA. And lastly, we will look at various research studies that are used in adversarial arguments against licensure in the OBM field. So the BCBA certification process may or may not be necessary to work in the field of OBM. As we know, being in the field, we see BCBAs are largely in demand for working with clients who have intellectual disability and autism. And according to Autism Speaks in 2018, as cited by Lukic et al. In 2018, around 70% of BCBAs work with this population. Why do BCBAs mainly work with this population if BCBA requirements, ethics codes, and principles are practice area neutral? So before we examine this, it must be said that a very high demand for BCBAs started a conference in 1972 to begin a credentialing and licensing process. And we truly wouldn't have a certification or licensing without this demand and rise in ABA training. However, we will look at the benefits that BCBA credentialing can lend to the field and how licensure can possibly create a barrier between BCBAs and big organizations who need OBMs. Again, this study examines the integration of OBM consultants into the ABA field, current ABA education level required to complete OBM tools correctly, and research around the impact and mismatch of licensure. According to Wilder, Austin, and Costella in 2009, OBM is the application of behavioral principles to individuals and groups in business, industry, government, and human service settings. And some subdisciplines of OBM include behavior-based safety, system analysis, and performance management. Behavior-based safety focuses on modification of work environments to reduce injury and increase safety conscious behavior systems. Analysis rearrange the processes and order by which individuals and teams do things to maximize efficiency. And performance management focuses on behavior change to create more meaningful results for the mission of a business. Wilder et al. 2009 describe OBM as a branch of ABA, of which business trainings, programs, and utilities are evaluated. The first OBMs were primarily hired by small businesses as consultants to help improve attendance or assist supervisors in decreasing negative commentary to workers. According to Wilder, Austin, and Costella 2009, the history of OBM didn't officially start until the 1960s. It must be noted that a number of influences outside of behavior science spurred its beginnings. The father of scientific management, Frederick Taylor, is not the same as the father of ABA. The first application of scientific management was at a Western electric plant in the 1930s, which was called the Hawthorne studies. And the study erroneously attributed lighting rather than monetary incentive to behavior performance. And this is an example of how ABA might have been more scientific and applicable in the beginning of OBM. In 1977, the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management was begun after multiple publications in the field had been published and a consulting firm was established. Some of the main categories that the JOBM, or Journal of Organizational Behavior Management, focuses on are employee productivity, safety skill trainings, absenteeism, tardiness, turnover, employee satisfaction, feedback systems, and monetary incentives. As the field has grown, some OBM certifications are rendered separately from ABA, and others are offered by schools as a separate track in ABA graduate programs. And currently, there is no official certification or licensure for the field of OBM. This means that a person can get into the OBM field without any official ABA training. Although the history is not necessarily headed by Skinner, the principles of behavior analysis are employed in common OBM procedures. As seen above, often a target behavior is operationally defined, a system of measurement is developed, and then an analysis of specific antecedents and stimuli that correlate with target performance is made. Once a procedure is put in place, constant feedback allows for OBMs to make adjustments based off the data collected. OBMs do a cost-benefit analysis and social validity is examined. Okay, so an example of how an OBM can help staff training in residential centers was outlined in the article by Wilder et al. In 2009. And there were direct staff at therapeutic center at a residential facility. And the context where this took place was in the office of the therapeutic center. This was a case study design. And the dependent variable was staff implementation of treatment plans and the use of data sheets. And the independent predictive variable was staff training on intervention plans. So staff was trained on data completion, data collection, opportunities to implement treatment plans, and given testing around data sheets retention. Visual aids and visual cues were hung in the worksite, in the resident rooms. Graphing results were updated around the staff training, and results were placed in staff break rooms using PDC, Performance Diagnostic Checklist, which we'll talk again about later, to identify environmental problems, which was utilized. And so social validity was examined through the consumer and staff interviews, and cost-benefit analysis of intervention was conducted following the intervention. As you can see, the responsibilities of the OBM are comparative, if not identical, to a BCBA supervisor. Even still, this is an example of an OBM working with a common population that BCBAs work with, that of people with intellectual disabilities. And so the job duties do look very similar to a BCBA supervisor. Okay, and the results are that after 2 months of intervention, therapeutic center reported a percentage in which staff implemented treatment plans increased from 60 to 80%, meeting the research goal of 75% correct implementation. And the conclusion was OBM used principles of behavior in evaluating interventions that increased human performance in the workplace. Some things to note about limitations of this study is, since there were only 2 settings applicable, generality was not strong. However, the generality across 2 age groups can be compared, and also steady state responding was not produced in the adolescent baseline design before training was implemented. The author used the word hypothetical to describe the data without reason or explanation, and this could possibly be referenced as hypothetical since an average of performance was plotted rather than individual performances. Since the data sheet was created by the consultant specifically for this study, there may be some biases, misidentified opportunities, or it could possibly lack internal validity. Testing for the accuracy of the data sheet might have been another step that could strengthen the procedure. Perhaps a group of people coming together to create and test the accuracy of the data sheet could create more internal validity. And as we can see from this study, there is some considerable overlap between OBM and BCBA methodologies. While a BCBA might be serving consumers and supervising staff around treatment plans, an OBM would be taking on more of a supervisory role to monitor staff. Now, let's take a look at some of the experimental studies that have been done around OBM performance tools. One in particular is called the Performance Diagnostic Checklist, Human Services. And this is a tool that is widely used in the field of OBM, which measures environmental variables that contribute to the performance in human service settings. And there are 4 domains plus a direct observation component, which includes intervention planning. The 4 domains are 1, training, 2, task clarification and prompting, 3, resources, materials, and processes, and 4, performance, consequences, effort, and competition. And the domains with the most negatively answered questions is targeted for intervention. Wilder et al. In 2019 set out to measure the validity and reliability of the tool in this study. He used 3 groups totaling 21 participants of people who had varying intelligence levels in terms of ABA principles. One group consisted of 7 participants, 5 female and 2 male, ages 24 to 31, who had BCBAs. And the second group consisted of 7 people, 4 females and 3 males, who had a bachelor's in psychology and some training in ABA. The third group consisted of 7 people, 6 females and 1 male, ages 19 to 22, who had little to no exposure to behavior analysis. I found it interesting that this study did not include people in the OBM field who do not have an ABA background. Test validity and reliability were measured as dependent outcomes across variables such as education level of participants and question complexities of each video interview. To assess the validity, the percentage of number correct on each form was calculated. To assess reliability, mean percentage scores was calculated, percentage of agreement compared to each participant's first test with their second test. Then total agreement for each participant was calculated by dividing the number of agreement by number of disagreements plus agreement for randomly paired participants within groups and between groups. This was multiplied by 100 and converted into a percentage. They calculated the mean retest agreement across all participants, and lastly, a mean inter-rater agreement percentage was calculated across all participants. Each trial consisted of watching 3 7-minute videos. In all videos, the interviewee, supervisor, and therapist were the same man at an ABC school. The interviewer's questions were always the same. The supervisor's responses varied, and the order of questions were sometimes slightly varied. Each video varied in complexity. One video indicated an issue in 1 domain, the other in 2, and the last video in 3. And all participants were called back in 2 to 4 weeks to do the procedure again for the sake of replication. Okay, so in the results, all participants identified problem areas accurately. The validity scores were 93% across all 3 videos and domains, and the mean test, retest, and inter-rater reliability was above 95%. Conclusion is that the PDC-HS may be valid and has a high test and inter-rater reliability. If we take a look at table 4 in the study, we can see that inter-rater agreement is high between all participants regardless of their knowledge of ABA. Some limitations where data was limited by lack of ambiguous or confusing or contradicting information in an interview tapes. So it was all kind of plotted out beforehand, and there were really no ambiguous or real life situations that were presented. Also, more externally valid situations should be incorporated into future studies. In terms of validity, there was no standard to measure aside from pre-selected outcomes. Second test answers may have been influenced by exposure to the tool in the first test. Participants were not able to complete the second test concurrently. For the sake of increased reliability and generality, this study was repeated again in 2020 by Symbol et al. 2020, who was actually one of the people who was involved in the last study. And this study is identical to the previous one, with the exception of an extension that could lend to more external validity than the previous study. So in this study, actual videos from interviews using PDC-HS were utilized, and all of the participants were called back to watch 3 videos again a month later. So 3 groups were given 3 videos to watch and score the PDC-HS accordingly. And a month later, they came back and did it again. The dependent outcome variable as validity was measured by percentage of correct on the PDC-HS form. Reliability scores were derived from mean percentage, total agreement score, mean test, and retest agreement across all participants. Independent predictive variables were education level and complexity level. Procedure was to watch 3 7-minute videos and score each situation on PDCHS twice over the span of 1 month. The results, all participants identified problem areas with a lower score than study 2. Validity scores were 86.11% across all 3 videos and domains. Mean test, retest, and inter-rater reliability was above 79.1%. And the conclusion is the PDCHS is still generally valid despite complexity of situations assessed. It's also significant to see that all participants scored within the same range. Bachelor's and BCBA mean level scoring were more identical, and pre-bachelor scores were slightly lower. Symbol et al. 2020 points out some limitations in the study that can also be considered limitations of the previous study. And the reason why these limitations were kept in place was for purposes of study replication. So some limitations were the size and the scope of the participant pool. Participants watched rather than conducted an interview. Some participants would have scored higher if they were able to have their questions answered. The intervention selection was not incorporated into the design. In the future, a study around the PDCHS should include selection of appropriate interventions. Let's now take a look at some advocates and adversaries of using BACB guidelines and ABA principles in the field of OBM. Although Luke et al. 2018 presents key BCBA requirements as practice area neutral and provides specific examples of their relevance to OBM, Weatherly 2021 specifically zones in on the BCBA Code of Ethics to be incorporated into OBM. Donald Hantula in 2022, on the other hand, outlines how the BCBA Code of Ethics has been refuted by the OBM field, saying that the ethics code decreases opportunities while increasing liability. He went on to say that the BCBA involvement would only increase ideological hegemony, professional disenfranchisement, and increase profits for certain universities and continuing education unit providers. He describes the version of ABA that is pushed by the BACB as intellectually impoverished. And in comparison, he goes on to describe OBM and the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management as rich with system analysis, organizational complexity, and sophistication. He went on to explain that the code was written for the protection of the most vulnerable persons at Sunland Center, and there is no history of such wrongdoing by OBM practitioners. Describes the code's limiting of gifts as socially insulting, and he points out that giving and receiving gifts is appropriate in business and is socially acceptable. Hantula 2022 goes on to mention that the code has been considered a form of consumer protection if applied to OBM. And he disputes this as well, saying that consumers don't need protection and they are generally intelligent enough to engage in business. He points out that whether or not the ethics code actually protects consumers is yet to be discerned. However, it does protect ABAs from competition. Hantula 2022 remarks, in the technological age, data scientists repair and create data systems, while analysts make recommendations. Soon, analysts will be replaced by computers. Although what Hantula mentions may be unsettling to some BCBAs, let's look at some research around licensure in the US and how it may present barriers to citizens looking for employment. So Carpenter 2 et al. And the second et al. In 2012 did research amongst American citizens, and he looked at 102 lower income occupations ranging from construction to education for 5 types of licensing requirements. And the 5 requirements were fees, education, experience, minimum grade completion, and minimum age. And all education experience requirements were converted into a common measure of estimated calendar days lost as all fees were summed. There were 5 steps to measuring licensure burdens. 1, all sub-requirements were added. 2, requirements were averaged across states. 3, requirements like dollars, days, exams, grades, and ages were converted to a common metric known as a standard score. 4, weights were added for more burdensome measurements. For example, a 20 was added to extensive education experience requirements and a 1.5 to minimum grade requirement. And 5 weighted T-scores for each requirement was summed. Each weighted T-score was then multiplied by the number of states that licensed the occupation. The results of this study are highlighted in the article, The Effects of Occupational Licensure Competition, Consumers, and the Workforce, which was written by McLaughlin et al. In 2017. I'm sorry, McLaughlin et al. 2017. And he asked the question, what is the state of empirical knowledge about the extent, growth, and stringency of state licensing requirements? And to what extent are such requirements uniform or varied across the states? To what extent do they vary by occupations? As compared to the 1950s, where only 5% of the workforce was licensed through state laws, 29% of the workers in America need to be licensed in 2006. After taking a look into experience, requirements, and exams for different fields in all states, Carpenter II et al. 2012 highlights the idea that patterns in occupational licensing requirements contradict the idea that licensure primarily is used to protect public safety. Occupations that are less likely to involve risk are often more highly controlled than riskier ones. Take a look at 28 days of training for a requirement to be an EMT worker as compared to the 105 days of education required to be a cosmetologist. The variation of hours across state license lines also present barriers to enter a field. Take a look at some mismatches that may stand out. McLaughlin et al. 2017 speaks about regulatory privilege. Although the BCBA requirements were not on this list, examination of the list in terms of social relevance and safety is questionable. More research needs to be done around how whether or not the quality of a BCBA's work improves upon licensure relevance to social safety, and the proportion of regulation compared to higher risk jobs. It would also be keen to investigate how licensure requirements prohibit behavior-minded people from getting into the field due to monetary fees and regulations. In the last research of this presentation, McLaughlin et al. 2014 uses regdata, which is a machine algorithm to find restrictive words like shall, must, and required to measure the amount of restriction and licensure requirements in the Code of Federal Regulation over time. The time period this study looks at is from 1997 to 2010. Governmental rules for American citizens are measured by high-tech machine learning tools that comb through the document and come up with statistical data on the frequency of these words as a function of restrictive measures. In the results, we see an upward trend in licensing over a 13-year period. Although the restrictive word usage in the legal document was already extraordinarily high at 850,000 restrictive words in 1997, and it increased by approximately 150,000 words by 2010. And I would have liked to see the graph drawn a bit more to scale to show how high restrictions generally are. Anyhow, the article did not list how the reg data was used or what the software consists of, nor did it mention anything about measuring accuracy of reg data. There was no measure here to find instances where such words like shall, must, and required may have been used without referencing licensing restrictions. And the study does conclude that restrictions have collectively been compounding and goes on to question why. Like the previous article we discussed by Hantula, 2022, McLaughlin et al. 2014 calls for reform by passing legislation that eliminates licensure burdens, establishes an independent commission charged with examining state licensing laws, and performs a comprehensive review of all occupations with the goal of identifying licensure requirements that can be eliminated or reformed. This, of course, would decrease barriers for obtaining employment, where merit rather than licensure would be the basis of employment. So based on what the researchers found, it seems in general, licensure restrictions and requirements around learning behavioral principles are quite severe compared to that of more risky jobs in America. And although ABA does have an ethics code and an exclusive workforce, I can see how OBM does not want to be restricted, creating jobs off related work merit rather than academic and law requirements. On the other hand, OBM may be shutting itself down the ABA methodology, which could possibly be beneficial as a science. It would be interesting to look at the effectiveness of ABA-trained professionals in the OBM field as compared to professionals who are trained in scientific management. I would be interested to see how ABAs who enter into the OBM field feel about applying their skills without having to keep up with the licensure stresses and requirements each year comparatively to domains of ABA that do require licensure. I would also like to see how ABA knowledge benefits such persons working in OBM. We need more unbiased studies around the social value of having BCBAs or ABAs in the business world. Lastly, for those of you like me who are preparing for the BCBA credentialing and interested in the field of OBM, more testing questions and studies around OBM should be incorporated in our learning materials.